So in this place, in this church, each Sunday, we primarily experience what may be labeled as a small, predominantly white, mainline church experience. But our denomination has small churches like us, many of them, large churches, medium churches. There are churches that worship in traditional African American styles. There are churches that are Hispanic or bilingual. There are churches that meet in homes, some even in bars and in prisons. We have Samoans and Canadians and Haitian churches and Puerto Ricans that are all gathering this morning or throughout the week to worship that amazing God that we all know and love in profoundly different and life-giving Pentecost Spirit-filled ways. And I want you to take a moment to celebrate this diversity. Celebrate that you have an important role as a little church with a big heart because Jesus is working through us in so many ways. And our call, our role in this Pentecost Spirit-filled movement only grows more profoundly when we are aware of the vast and amazing worship ways that connect us to one another and a God who is present in this world. Last week, this also includes our connections with other denominations and belief systems. And while I am not always comfortable in other settings, anytime I engage in a worship style that is different than mine, I always find out more about my journey of faith. I walk away with either positive or negative experiences that are outside of my norm, but I have found that I have grown in some way and closer to God. Because it is holy work. It is truly holy work to worship both within and outside of our comfort zones. We must be willing to engage in prayerful, mindful, and meaningful relationships with one another, but also in prayerful, meaningful, and a variety of worship relationships. As we've said many times, if we limit ourselves to our bubbles, then we are letting ourselves, the images, the stereotypes, the injustices, and the stigmas placed that separate us to create hurt and voids. We must seek to understand and know a God that has sent his Son to be a light of love for the whole world, beyond just ourselves and what we know and understand. Last week, as we listened to Eric and Holly share their stories of losing their son Nick and the stigmas around the heroin epidemic, Eric kept repeating that word, stigma. Stigma is the feeling of being ashamed, humiliated, disgraced. A stigma, as they alluded to, is something that makes us feel like we have to hide. It makes us feel embarrassed to be truthful, honest, and real. And even when we are able to be truthful, stigmas often come with baggage that cannot be expressed or explained easily, and so people find that they just stay quiet until they finally have no choice but to scream. And yet when they're all of a sudden screaming or losing it at that point, they've lost the sense of what to say or who to be as a person and as God's child. Because often, as we know, those inside the church are supposed to represent the faithful and the good. And therefore, sometimes we have to be honest that there are those in churches that tend to be even more secretive and hidden, and sometimes feel that the church might be a little judgy. And whether or not we realize that our church bubbles can limit us to unintentionally hurt others, because nobody wants to be that church. Or maybe we do want to be that church. The church that can be a place where we face with God and Jesus in a great sense of love the stigmas and images that limit and hold others, including ourselves, back from knowing how deep and wide and great God's love can truly be through Jesus Christ. A place where we can celebrate being that kind of church. The one that loves. The one that can recognize others and realize that it's not about being other, but about being with one another. And that's been hard. That's a challenge from the beginning. The letters of Paul are filled with this plea for unity. And he does not invite the sameness in these pleas, but he recognizes that enmity can come when we continue to find ways to label us and them. Paul recognizes that the message of a risen Christ can overcome the stigmas and limits. Paul recognizes that he has a message that is beyond the rules that separate us and the divisions that divide us. And that instead, Paul reminds us that Christ came with a message and a love that unites us. One of our mantras as disciples of Christ has always been, unity is our polar star. Let us remember that unity is not sameness. It doesn't mean that we're all of a sudden comfortable with one another or think all the same. As Carol and I work together in our sermon series, I want to remind you that we want a variety of voices to be invited ongoingly to the table where God welcomes all of us. And there may at times feel, and we have to be honest with those feelings of us and them. But as people of faith, we come to the table as a we. We are all God's. Paul reminds us that we are all God's children first and foremost. And that unity, once again, does not come in sameness. Sameness is boring, and I don't think God is that boring. I think God is creative and loving and forgiving and merciful and all these adjectives and verbs that celebrate the beauty of the world around us and seek to celebrate the differences that we find in one another, not the sameness. And thus, as a denomination, we continue to find ways to seek unity in our differences. I do want to highlight, as we continue through learning about all the different possibilities of ways to engage in our ministries on the general and regional and local levels, the three general areas that this week are kind of important for you to note. Many times we are the leaders in ecumenical and interfaith endeavors. We are active participants in the World Council of Churches, and the Kentucky Council of Churches has been led by disciple pastors for years, including recently these two who are wonderful disciples in our area. We also have a general level ministry called the Council on Christian Unity. It works with ecumenical and interfaith partners to keep important and crucial dialogue open between different denominations and faith beliefs. We also have a team at the general level that specifically highlights the conversations and teachings, as we know, around being a pro-reconciliation and anti-racist church. We seek to reconcile the damage done by race and systematic divisions and misunderstandings. And the last one that I also want to share with you that is up here, that doesn't really have a symbol but is important to know about, is that 50 years ago within our denomination, there was an intentional movement at the general level to work more with the voices of those in our Black congregations. They created what we call the merger agreement 50 years ago, 1967. I have to think, like, when I started thinking about it, that's a hard time to make an intentional movement in this hot topic area of race. And yet, our denomination stepped forward and said, we want to be intentional about the variety of voices that are gathering in our leadership and at the table. And what's interesting, though, is even as I put this sermon together, these still hot topics 50 years later. And yet, if I really think about it, I have to go back and listen to Paul's words and even realize how risky those words were for him 2,000 years ago. And I share this history with you not because I have deep answers all the time of how we can engage in the best ways to find unity and love and Christ in one another. I actually end up coming to you as your pastor with always more questions. And the question that keeps raining out in my head from the last few weeks with our church and chats is how do we overcome all the stigmas that still continue to bind us? Because of the stigmas of what it means to be poor and hungry and addicted or ill or some sort of other in the world. And yet God has continued through the words of Paul, through the words of people who seek to know God, to know that love comes through the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. God wants us to know that love, the love that can help us move outside of our comfort zones into the areas where stigmas and labels are not buried in the tombs and darkness, but are able to merge in ways that truly know what it means to be loved by a resurrected Christ. To know that there is life beyond what feels like death. And there is love beyond the stigmas that hold us back. And that we know a God who is worthy of amazing worship styles in so many forms because we are creatively different and wonderful and beautiful and God's. And what was interesting is I put many pieces of this sermon together last Sunday evening as I traveled. And when I came back to revisit it yesterday, I found myself surprised at its relevance in light of the Charlottesville protest. I would love to say that we've come really far over the last 50 years since that merger agreement. I would love to say we've come far over the last 2,000 years since Paul began uniting us in our faith in Jesus. But I don't think, and we probably never will, but that doesn't mean we don't try, that we need to continue to come as far as the Holy Pentecost Spirit of all those different languages, being able to hear each other, that Spirit that still moves around and in us. That's the Spirit that wants us to keep moving farther and forward, beyond the human laws, but instead transcend into the righteousness that had only come when we are able to stay open to seeing God and one another. And so let us remember love and God. Let Christ be what sees beyond the stigmas and the labels. Let Christ that knows us and this small, loving church in Independence, Kentucky. That's the Christ who seeks to bring justice to all of us, who believe that God transcends the human barriers that separate us. You see, God is the one who can continue to merge us together. Black, white, Asian, Hispanic, young, old, middle, ill, addict, foster kid, grandparent, sick, caregiver, Greek, Jew, slave, free, man or woman. Humans will continue to mess up. Again and again, that's who we are. But God continues to provide us with these great promises. The greatest being from our faith in Jesus Christ. And it reminds us to look beyond what we see and unite in a way that sees beyond the stigmas that hold us back.